Hi everyone, it's TTL back with another video for you, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Radeon VII. And the reason why it's called the 7 is because it's the first GPU ever made on the 7nm process. Now we are going to be comparing it with cards like the Vega 64, which it does look a lot like, but underneath the hood they are very incredibly different. But we're also going to be comparing it to cards like the 2080, which is what even AMD compare it to. I think it was kind of an aiming point for them to target to as well. But they do talk about lots of things, even the 1080 Ti, in some of their literature that they sent out to us reviewers and the stuff that they made us watch. But let's pause now, do the intro, and then crack on. Okay, so the Radeon 7, it's been everywhere since CES, and I know a lot of you AMD enthusiasts are incredibly excited about the latest GPU to be released from them. Now obviously Lisa Su had it in her hands at CES, and everyone has been buzzing about it since, and it is the first GPU to ever be made on the 7nm process, which is a huge step forward. But it's kind of weird because there amazingly isn't a unified measurement of nanometer. So there is actually a little bit of wavering difference between the way all of the different companies kind of rate it. But to be honest with you, I don't care. It's their first 7nm process. So put that to one side and then let's crack on. So the actual Radeon 7 itself, I think they have taken a lot of the design cues from the old 64 design, and I love the fact it's got the aluminium shroud on it. Now it's not, a lot of people ask me if it was cast or forged or anything like that, but it feels like it's billet machined because there are a lot of very crisp edges on it. It does give it an incredibly premium feel. There is a vapor chamber and heat pipes hidden underneath the cover, and you do get two 8-pins on the left hand side, but we are forgetting about the actual core details of the card itself. Now there are 60 compute units, 3,840 stream processors, and 16GB of HBM2 memory. And when you look at the die that the Radeon 7 has compared to the old X64, is you can see that one's got the 4 HBM modules on it, and you can see that the other one only has the 2. Now HBM has 4GB per of those little stacks, so you can basically do the rough maths there. Now one thing that I will say between the two is you can see the huge difference in the die size. Now that's obviously because you've got, with the Radeon 7, you do have that much smaller die size in the middle. Now although you've got that smaller die size, and a lot of people think smaller is better, but that does inherently mean there is a smaller surface area available for cooling, so that can cause some issues. Now I'm not saying it has caused any issues, I'm saying, you know, it's going to make AMD's life that little bit harder because there is a smaller surface area on the top for you to be able to contact any kind of cooling plate to obviously aid your cooling. So we'll talk about temps and all of that sort of stuff in a minute anyway. Now one thing I will say is there is a 750 megahertz boost clock with a 1.8 gigahertz maximum peak clock. Now I'm not sure whether many of you will be aware, but the Radeon 7 is essentially the Instinct M150 server GPU. It was announced / released by AMD in early November last year, and despite there being a slight difference in the actual core counts, they're essentially based on the core speed. So the peak on the M150 Instinct is actually, I think it's 1748 megahertz, whereas we've gone up to 1800 megahertz with the Radeon 7. But essentially it's pretty much the same. The PCB and the kind of like the packaging that it comes in is very different because this is obviously more of a kind of gamery edged kind of product. and the way they've gone about it. But the actual kind of silicon that's underneath, the actual core that's underneath, is pretty much exactly the same. Well, it's not pretty much exactly the same, it is exactly the same. And it kind of also leads you to where the Radeon 7 has got its 16GB of HBM from as well. Because obviously when AMD first released HBM, they were saying that you didn't need as much memory because it was high bandwidth and it could process everything quicker. Whereas now we're seeing more and more of it being added, and they do say that's going to aid with content creators and that sort of stuff, and people with incredibly high frame rates at 4K. But one of the things I will say is, as far as gamers are concerned, 16GB is an awful lot. Now that could be seen as being future-proof, so that you've got more video memory there for when you require it. But the problem is, if you do need more video memory, you also need a little bit more horsepower as well, because of being able to process everything that is being done or being held in the RAM in the first place. So that's something to keep in mind, that yes, the random access memory, which is what the HBM is a good thing because you can dump it all out there, but you then do need to consider the inherent implications of not having a GPU with enough grunt to drive it in the first place. Now, I'm not saying that the Radeon 7 hasn't got enough grunt, and we will talk a lot about the actual GPU performance in a bit. So I think they've got the kind of design cues on par. I'm also personally quite enthused about the fact that they've moved away from the blower effect kind of style, because although it does help with a smaller case where you can actually exit the heat out the back of the system, they do end up being that little bit noisier. And to be honest with you, with these sort of things, they always ended up better when you had an AIO or something, because they did do a water-cooled version of the 64. So with this one, they've kind of gone down to, it looks more like an aftermarket card. One of the things I will say is, when you do have cards like this, it does then, as I've said, put the heat inside the case itself. But with modern cases and airflow and all of that sort of thing, most of the aftermarket cards nowadays just dump all the heat inside the cases anyway, so it's not a negative point whatsoever. Now the temperatures, I will talk to you when we get down to like the other side of the rig, because we're going to see it in a case. In fact, I've got it. I'm going to be putting it in a Threadripper rig for you, which, why don't we just go there now? So on to the new kind of gaming stroke battle station, workstation area, where we're going to be doing the conclusions and talking through the performance now. Now the system on display is just something I put together to kind of hold the graphics card for this part of the video. Now it's a Cooler Master SL600 case, which I've chosen, yes, because of the funky layout, but it also means I've got a very easy vertical GPU to be able to show you off in the B-roll, and the silver design of the case really nicely matches the silver on, or the aluminium on the GPU itself. Yes, they are different fans in the bottom. They're actually the fans that I pulled out of a white H500P just so that I could utilise the LEDs in those 200mm fans, which I did think that this case should have had in the first place. Anyway, the motherboard is a X399 Meg Creation, so that does mean there is a 2970WX in there. Now, I did not use this setup for my complete testing. We've used the normal graphics card test rig, which you can go onto the Overclock 3D website and have a look at the full specs there if you do want to. But it's basically a 6850K that we've been using for quite a few years, and that is just literally so that we have got a barrage of possible graphs and data to be able to compare to. So this was just a nice, pretty thing to show you at the beginning of this. Anyway, so the GPU itself. Yes, it does look rather nice in there, and I think we're probably, another reason why we've got this set up like this is this may end up becoming something that we're going to be using personally in the office to help render videos and other stuff that we've got going forward. So that's another reason why you get to see it here today. And I also think that with the lighting on all of this set to white rather than the unicorn puke so that it can be, it actually looks kind of nice. Anyway, oh, you will actually be getting to see this system running some rather insane HDR stuff next week as well. We're just running through some tests and stuff. I have a huge monitor to be able to test it on, which I'll talk to you about next week, but come back if you want to have a look. Anyway, I did say to you about cooling, and that was something with this. There were two temperatures in the Wattman software that you got to see. And once the GPU got to 70 degrees, the secondary, which they called the junction temperature, was at 110. Now, one thing I will say is the junction temperature, what would normally happen is, let's say your junction was 100 degrees and your GPU was at 70, there would be a 30 degrees junction temperature because it's the distance away from the actual T junction. So the junction temperature on the software with this, that actually climbed with the actual GPU temperature itself. So it was something that kind of, it confused me a little bit. But anyway, so if the GPU, our GPU was reading 71 degrees, which we got it to in the bulk of the games and testing actually, the junction temperature was 100 degrees. Now the card didn't feel exceptionally hot. There was nothing about it that was baking, you know, the back plate didn't feel like you could cook food on it, which we've had in some GPUs from all of the brands in the past. So it wasn't particularly sending off any alarm bells. The only alarm bells that it was sending off were if you left the GPU to its own devices, once it got to 70 degrees, the fans were at 100%, which was 3000 RPM. Now, you can manually set a fan profile up in Wattman, that's not a problem. But the thing that we found is if you did mess around with any of that, it ended up giving you a little bit of a negative performance impact because of temperatures then rising. So it's one of those ones where it's definitely one for those of you out there that aren't particularly bothered about noise or always have cans on, or you know, you haven't got anyone around you that you can annoy. If you're a silent gamer or anything like that, then maybe the reference design isn't going to be something that you'll be wanting to look at, which is kind of a sad thing. There's also no hint of a AIO stroke water-cooled all-in-one version at the moment either. So temperatures were good, but it was good because the fan speeds, even though there was 3 of them, were blowing an absolute hoolie. So that's that. We'll talk about, we don't need to talk about that again. We will then move on. One thing I will say is we did, if you want to go to the OC3D website, go and have a look at all the results. But one thing that you're going to see in the video review today is there are no overclocking results. And I went to AMD about it, and well, actually I have to go to their agency to talk to the agency about it. And I said, literally, I can't get it to overclock. Anything we touch, you're either getting literally like a couple of points increase on a benchmark, or more often than not, the benchmark results went down. And they gave me some stuff to try, and everything that we did for an entire day, going backwards and forwards, was dropping the scores. And then I literally then got this email back saying it's a known problem. Now, for a major launch like this to not be able to overclock feels a little bit janky to me, and you would have thought that this would have been something that would have been covered a long way back. Now, I don't know what it is. If you do overclock it and you increase the power limits and all that sort of stuff, I genuinely think that it's going to draw more power anyway. So, you know, you could speculate that it's going to draw a lot more power and it may look bad. But also because of the fact that the card is at 70 degrees with 100% fans, if you were to overclock it any further and increase all that sort of stuff, it's probably going to get a fair bit hotter as well. You don't know whether you'll hit any thermal limits. So it does make me wonder if they're hoping that the initial wave of reviews are going to go out and then they'll unlock the overclock and it won't get spoken about. But because of the way that the market works now, we are all going to end up talking about it anyway. Now, this is only speculation, but it is speculation based on the fact that the fans are already at 100%, and any overclocking that we do is going to be increasing power limits and then thus increasing heat. Now, with the old cards, yes, undervolting did have a positive impact on the performance of the card, and undervolting with a little bit of a an overclock and some extra power did unlock some extra performance. But when it did unlock that extra performance, it did then also unlock some extra heat as well. So you do, you know, we have to kind of keep these things in mind. And I'm not saying that is what is going to happen. I'm just talking to you guys about it, as is my style, like mates in the pub. And we're just going to have to see what happens a little bit later on. So you've only got stock results. Now, you do think now I'm laying you up for the results to not be that good, but I'm actually incredibly positive with all of these results. Even like the average clock speeds and the peak clock speeds, I was incredibly happy with. So our average was basically the boost clock, and our peak was 1801 megahertz, which is what they were saying was the absolute boost clock speed anyway. So all of these things kind of fell into place and all looked really nice. Now don't forget, with all of these graphs, I'm just going to kind of drip them in for you here. We always put a few here, but there are a lot more results and there's loads more going on the OC 3D website. But the performance was consistently at or around the 2080, which was what we were promised in a lot of the graphs and stuff that we saw before. It was also kind of kicking around the old 1080 Ti kind of numbers in a lot of the benches, and it was incredibly consistent. Considering that this is a graphics card at launch and it's putting out all of these kind of numbers, it was all really positive. You know, we were getting good numbers, 4K numbers were great, and obviously 4K is probably I still think 4K is a little bit silly because you need so much horsepower to be able to run 4K. It almost makes more sense to get a 1440p monitor, get those extra frames per second in, and just, you kind of love it. The widescreen monitors that you can get are a nice kind of go-between. This is a 34-inch wide. I can't remember the actual resolution of this one, but it's the PG348. And that's kind of a good in-between spot. But I do think that 4K gaming, it does need an awful lot. And what you also need to remember is, yes, some games do run great, but some games are still resource hogs as well. So 4K 60 is a bit of a kind of hallowed kind of area, but I do think that you need a massive screen to be able to get the most from 4K rather than like a 27-inch monitor. And I personally favour a 27-inch screen, 2560 by 1440, few extra frames per second. And don't forget, if you buy a 144Hz screen, and you can have that extra refresh rate. But a lot of us are now going down the kind of FreeSync and the synced route. So if your graphics card, and you are synced, if your graphics card stroke your game is playing at, let's say, 90 frames per second, then you're actually playing the game at 90 frames as well, despite the fact that if your monitor has the ability to go to 120 or 144 hertz stroke frames per second anyway. So that is something to keep in mind, and that's another reason why I sometimes say it's better to go down to 1440p but have all those extra frames, especially if you're syncing. Anyway, deep breath. So games results, they're all nice. Some of them were a little bit below the 2080, some of them were actually a little bit above. It depended on the game and the title. But it was very consistent around. There was no point that the Radeon VII was ever left red-faced, but at the same time there was never any kind of point where the Radeon VII left the greens with a red face either. Now, you do need to keep in mind that the Radeon VII, as it is here today, it's going to be $699, and we finally got a GBP price, going to be $649 GBP. So it's basically $700 or £650. So that's fairly high. Now that's obviously a little bit less than what we were given with the 2080 at launch, which is what AMD have smashed it down as being its competitor. Now there's obviously been a lot of a chatter online with lots of people being very uncomfortable with RTX pricing and the fact that the pricing all kind of shifted up a notch, but the performance was, you know, roughly around the same thing. And it's definitely going to be a bone of contention with a lot of people. I think that a lot of people were expecting the Radeon VII to maybe come in a little bit cheaper, maybe kind of £75 or £100 less. What's made things even more kind of difficult though is literally within the last couple of days, a lot of the 2080s have gone down to 649 as well. It's clearly a market thing because of the Radeon 7 coming out, but you know, competition is good. But if the Radeon 7 had been that bit cheaper, then the 2080 prices might have come down that little bit more anyway. The other thing to think about is that the prices, the 649 GBP on this, or the $699, is for that card. By the time it goes out to the vendors and they've put it on their own custom PCB, custom design PCB, with, you know, bigger, flashier, quieter, hopefully coolers, price is going to increase as well. So this will literally be a starting point, and I would not flinch if you saw cards going way up into the high 700s and maybe even touching the £800 mark by the time that you add in the tax, like I said, for the custom PCBs and the flashier coolers and stuff. I do think this will bode well with a better cooler on it as well, because the noise on it for me personally just wasn't good enough. So I do think we need to get these into the hands of the decent vendors that have properly good coolers, maybe like Sapphire from the, then they're obviously a favoured AMD camp, but also maybe even to see what an Asus Strix cooler could do with this as well. But obviously with the Strix, as you always know, where that is the flagship Asus GPU, you get the flagship Asus GPU pricing. But let's face it, neither of those kind of cards they can really make quick enough. So I think really what we're going to get to here is the can AMD churn them out quick enough. Now there was a lot of chatter about there not being many cards. Now at launch we are hearing there aren't going to be many cards, but we're also hearing that after the initial allocation, the next wave of GPUs might be a bit fruitful, but this is still just pure speculation, and it's only going to be something that we can tell over time. Now, one thing I will say is it's actually great that AMD are back with a card. I don't really particularly care about the 2080 Ti because, if I'm honest, that card is so expensive that it's out of reach for most people anyway. And the 2080 stroke, even I'd say 2060, is probably about the kind of points where a lot of people will end up going. I'm not saying that's like the volume sales, but that's kind of the point where most people are going to aspire to. So plonking the Radeon 7 there is great. I would genuinely love to see some 2060 competition slightly lower down as well. Now I know a lot of you are going to be talking about the 590 and stuff, but I think we need something with the newer tech. And I've looked at the server GPUs, and I'm not sure that we're going to get anything with HBM or anything because of there's such high costs of building these sorts of parts. But it doesn't matter. The Radeon 7 is a great gaming card. I'm going to actually be digging into the possibilities of it being a good, like a rendering card as well. So for those of you out there that are content creators and stuff like that, it's also something that obviously over time when the drivers get sorted out, it'd be good to see what this is like with some Ryzen-ness for streaming and the like as well. Because obviously you've got a lot of VRAM on this, you've got a lot of processing cores with Ryzen, so there are the possibilities of it being a really nice tick box. I've already said that we've already paired our Ryzen 7 up with a Threadripper 2970. Now we've gone for the 24 over the 32 core for plain and simple reasons. Is the 27 was around and we could use it. The 32 core is actually being tested in some rather mental boards at the moment that we are having to absolutely obliterate the VRMs on. So that's kind of an indication this was something that we knew we could use, and we weren't going to have to keep taking it apart. Anyway, so it has been incredibly nice to finally have something new from AMD and it not be down the lower end of the market. Yes, we've not had any massive temperature hikes to worry about, but I do think the cooler needed a bit of work, and I am slightly concerned about the lack of overclocking before the normal review, because that is something that feels like they should have either delayed or it should have been sorted beforehand. So there will be more content from me on overclocking, whether it gets fixed, if there is any, you know, temperatures and all of that sort of stuff in the not too distant future. But to be honest with you, if you were wondering about 2080 and the Radeon VII, they are incredibly close. And there is going to be a lot of chatter about, a lot of people aren't fussed about RTX, so they're happy to spend a bit less. And at the present moment in time, although Nvidia would shout very, very loudly about DLSS, there is very little support for it at the moment. So it's always going to be speculation. It's going to be down to personal choice. You know, are you going to invest more money in something or around the same sort of money in something on a technology that could end up being in games later on? I think it's really going to come down to your favourite games, and that might be what sways opinion. So my only real negative about this card at the present moment in time is really fan noise and lack of overclocking. But the performance is there without the overclocking, so if we do manage to get any more out of it, that's all going to be a Billy bonus. So it's all been rather good. I'd love to know your thoughts underneath. And this has been the tiniest one with the Radeon VII out. Don't forget, I'm going to be doing FreeSync 2 HDR with this card and a rather enormous monitor probably next week.